This can be our video for Unit 4, Day 6. This is going to be the last video, last set of notes for the unit before we start our review and the test. So, we're continuing what we did yesterday, where we learned to solve rational equations. Alright, what we did yesterday was we turned them into proportions, and we did that by combining fractions. That was either adding or subtracting fractions, and then solving by cross-multiplying once they were proportions. So we also learned a second way where we multiply the whole equation by a common denominator, and we'll do both using these new kind of equations as well. One thing we saw yesterday is every equation we ended up with after we cross-multiplied they were all linear equations. They all had one answer, had our plain x's. However you can remember linear equations, they were all linear equations. Now the extra step for today is that when we cross-multiply or do whatever to get our equation at the end with no more fractions in it, we're going to have quadratic equations today. So it's going to make it one step harder. Alright, remember though, if you ever need help remembering how to do these, if you forgot how to do this from the last unit, you can look back at the Unit 3 videos and see everything we did there was solving quadratic equations. So what we're going to do is we'll go through both of our two different ways for solving quadratic equations, or solving rational equations. So the first way we talked about yesterday was to combine fractions and cross-multiply. And that's what we'll do with the two on the left-hand side. But the other way we learned was to actually multiply the entire equation by a common denominator. And that's what we'll do with the two on the right-hand side. So starting with the first one on the left, we look at the way this is set up. This is already a proportion. And we should recognize that actually we have one fraction equal to another fraction. That's what a proportion is two equal ratios. And the way we solve proportion is by cross-multiplying. And here's where I'm going to get my quadratic equation. So I cross-multiply x times x makes x squared. That's how we end up with quadratic. And then we multiply the other way. Don't forget to distribute. 3x plus 18. So from here, now we have to remember everything we did with quadratics in the last unit. We recognize it's quadratic, we see the x squared. First thing we do is put it into standard form. So I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. And then I'm also going to subtract 18, so I have one side equal to 0. Now also going back to what we did last unit, solving a quadratic equation. X squared minus 3x minus 18 is 0. We see that there's no leading coefficient, or a equals 1. That's our shortcut. And what that tells us to do is look for two numbers that are going to multiply and make negative 18. At the same time, add together and make negative 3. Alright, so we can think about that for a little bit. Multiply negative 18, add up to negative 3. And the two that are going to work here are a negative 6 and a positive 3. Again, we're going to go through these pretty quick since we just did this in the last unit. But if you didn't quite get it from last year, you kind of forget what we did in Unit 3, you can go back, look at those videos, or you can try some other problems. I can give you some other problems to do where you can practice this. Remember, once we get to this step, we're not done yet though. We have our two factors, we don't have our two answers. So we still have to set these equal to 0, each factor, and solve these little equations. So I have negative 3 as one answer, and a positive 6 as the other. that one was lucky. We already had a proportion. It was already set up to cross multiply. This one here at the bottom left is not set up that way. Look at this. We have two fractions on the left-hand side. So we need to combine these. Alright, the way we combine is adding and subtracting fractions. So we need a common denominator. So look at the two denominators in this problem. I have x squared and I have x. The common denominator between those two would be x squared. So this one is already over a common denominator of x squared. The second one is missing a factor of x. So once they're over a common denominator, I can add them, I can combine them together. But since they're not like terms at the top, one is a constant term, it's a number, 10. The other one's a linear term, x. I can't combine those because they're not like terms, so I can still write this as one fraction. I'm just not going to combine the two terms on the top of the fraction. So we're going to have two terms in our numerator. And now that it's a proportion, we have one fraction on either side. Everything's the same as what we just did. We cross multiply and distribute when we need to. Then once we set this in the standard form, x squared minus 5x minus 50. And so I'm looking for my two numbers that multiply negative 50 and add up to a negative 5. What works there is a negative 10 and a positive 5. And those are my factors. To get my answers, I'm going to set each one equal to 0 and solve, or you can think of it as just flipping the sign with these linear factors. So now we're going to go through the other way, which is where we actually multiply the whole equation by a common denominator. This one on the top right, x over 2 minus 12 over 2x equals 2, which just for good measure we can put over 1 so we have all fractions. Now just like before, I'm going to be looking for a common denominator. I'm going to look for a common denominator throughout the whole problem. So between 2, 2x, and 1. My common denominator here would be 2x. So what that means, I'm going to take this equation I'm going to multiply everything by 2x. So now distribute to this first term, 2x times 2 is 4x. When I distribute to the second term, what happens is that this 2x will cancel out with this 2x, and I'm just left with 12. When I distribute to the last term, use a different color for this one, the 2's cancel out, but I still have this factor of x. And when I multiply that x by the other x, I end up with x squared. So now we have our resultant quadratic equation again, and all the steps are going to be the same. We start by putting it in a standard form, so we subtract that 4x to bring it over to this side. Look for our two numbers that multiply and make 12, add together and make a negative 4. And once we have our two factors, we set each one equal to 0 and solve. So let's do one more example of that way real quick, and then on the back of this sheet there's going to be 4 problems for you to practice on your own. Going through these and trying to solve these on your own, see which way you like better, and follow that process. So for this last one, we're going to use that common denominator method again. So we're going to look at this problem and find a common denominator between 7, 7x, and 1. Alright, similar format to the last one, 7x will be our common denominator. which means as I multiply, different things are going to cancel out on each term by cross cancellation, whatever factors are in common. So on the first term, I have just the 7 cancels out. I still have the x. So that leaves me with the x squared from that first term. On the second term, the whole 7x cancels out, and I'm left with just 49. And on the last term, I have 7x times negative 2, which is negative 14x. Now we have our quadratic equation. We put it in standard form. And now we can solve it this way. Two numbers that multiply to 49 add up to 14 would be two positive 7s. So in this case, I'm actually going to get the same answer twice. Negative 7. So now some of these we went through pretty quickly. So if you have any questions, you can ask questions. Want to break down the steps in the process, we can go over that. If you want to look up any other videos, you can look for solving rational equations. For the first part of this, working it down to proportion across multiplying, or else multiplying the entire equation by a common denominator, either one of those. Or for the second part, where we're solving the quadratic equations, you can look at solving quadratic equations by factoring. Alright, remember that anything for this stuff, solving linear or quadratic equations, I have stuff for that also in Unit 3 on Canvas if you want to look back at some of that stuff. If you're feeling comfortable, you've seen the examples, and think you can try this on your own, go ahead and start those 4 problems on the back and see if you can do those on your own.